I mean, I feel like we have several technologies that have suddenly landed here, including this kind of, AI that sort of really works and isn't a joke, and things like CRISPR that let an individual or small group kind of get in and start doing some serious DNA hacking. And suddenly we have this situation where an individual has a lot of power to cause mayhem. It can happen, and there are a lot of people that have that same technology that don't cause mayhem. A lot of people that can do good with those same technologies, but just the mayhem factor is pretty new. And I think in society the closest thing is like whenever we had, the Second Amendment or something, and somebody said, yeah, everybody ought to be able to have a gun to protect themselves against bears, indigenous who don't like us. That the mayhem that you could create with one of those blunderbusses was pretty small scale, unless you convinced everybody else to go along with your mayhem plan. But that is not really the case with these technologies.
Computer engineer and AI expert David Demaris joins John, Suzy, and Scoop on this episode of the Plutopia podcast. We discuss ChatGPT and artificial intelligence, Microsoft's Bing chatbot, deepfakes, dangerous technologies, bad actors, and much more.
Of course, David Demaris has been with us before. He's a freelance consultant, a computer engineer, an AI expert, an artist, and a musician who will be playing tomorrow night at Cork and Screw, incidentally, here in Austin. And Dave's joining us for a discussion of artificial intelligence and I also said, and robot wisdom. Who knows what that is? So, and the first question I had in the description of our talk tonight, Dave, is will ChatGPT take over the world? Is that a good start?
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, it's really got its at least as much mind share as it deserves to have right now. It's seems to be all that almost everybody I knew was talking about for 2 or 3 months there. But how will it take over the world? Well,
can you just one real quick question? Because there are a lot of us who really don't know what it is. And I was wondering if you could just break it down real quickly before you tell us that it's going to be our overlord.
Well, are you asking what artificial intelligence is or what ChatGPT is?
What ChatGPT is.
Okay.
So ChatGPT, released by OpenAI last year, is the latest in a series of packagings of this what's called large language models. And large language model is what happens when you take a neural network architecture invented 5-6 years ago maybe and turn it loose on all of the data in the world. Very large set of writing, so that it is able to somehow regurgitate variations on everything that it is seeing.
Okay.
Now, when I look at this, I am a little unclear on whether that's all that's going on, because a lot of the critical analysis that I see says, I know what a transformer is. I can try to explain a little bit about it, what's different about other neural networks, but I am not completely sure that it is all that you see when you look at ChatGPT or Bing is strictly a transformer. And the sort of one of the big critiques of transformers is that all they are is a prediction engine that is predicting the next word, which is,
Oh, wow.
And it's looking at a pretty big window of what came before. That was actually one of the sort of breakthroughs in generative language models like this from the past, because they typically had a pretty small and a pretty fixed window. And the sort of big breakthrough in transformers was you would have this layer called an attention, well, set of layers called attention heads. And there were several of these things. And the idea with these is that you would actually train them like how far back in time or how far back in the text stream the important word for predicting the next sentence was. And they would play these kind of games during training, like what's called masking out an area. So you say like, we know that what should come next in the text is this, but we're gonna sort of block part of it out. And then you have to predict what should fill in the blank there. And that would somehow give you some insight into which were the most important. When you would like fail and get better and better at that prediction, these transformer heads would say like, it's actually so many words before that actually are important to determine what should come ahead in this language, in this kind of conversation. So that was kind of the new magic of transformers compared to the previous generation of, translators and
Okay.
Bad joke creators and whatever,
Okay.
Turing test things were out. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that was a big deal. So when I have interacted with these things, and I have actually done a little bit of professional work on chatbots, not really with this generation of things that are a little bit more of the old school, chatbots that basically are just matching templates, looking at phrases in what the person says or typed and trying to look through its database and, come back with something and maybe
Like what you get when you chat with the Mac people or whoever. Is that what you mean? Like it'll just say someone will be with you in a few minutes and it's usually a bot anyway.
Yeah. That's sort of more bot level thing. But I mean, the group that I was doing this with, and I feel like myself were, reasonably sophisticated and, know that this is not great. So what can you do that's better? And, I'm just sort of looking at it. So within the field of linguistics and where it meets up with AI, whenever you're talking about the structure of dialogues and what people are doing when they interact with one another, that sort of subfield of linguistics is called pragmatics, or, to some extent like dialogue theory. And so I feel like in a lot of ways that is one of the least developed areas. It is one of the ones that is least developed in terms of AI. It can kind of bleed over into sociology or social linguistics to some extent, and kind of bleeds over into acting theory and directing. So and that's actually when I was working this job with a team of writers, we did some things like just trying to make the dialogue expressive. We would say, whatever comes out, like if this is going to be a response, we should look at it in terms of what's the intent of this statement, and kind of mark up the emphasis on the words to express that. And this is something that I pulled straight out of an acting textbook here by Barry Pineo, who was a teacher in Austin for a while. So there's a certain amount of crossover between people who are working on dialogue agents prior to transformers and some of these other kind of theories. So there are ideas like, when you're reading a text by Shakespeare and you're an actor and you're trying to figure out line by line what's going on, you might be asked to say like, break the text into sections and figure out like, what is this character's motivation during this section? And how are they trying to change the mind of the other person in the dialogue?
So basically getting rid of any kind of thinking that one might have to do when one reads a classic like Romeo and Juliet. You don't figure it out for yourself. You just wait for someone else to tell you.
No, I think that the acting student is supposed to figure out for themselves. But they're supposed to kind of get below the surface and imagine that, okay, like a character in a play can be deceptive. They can, or in real life, they
Sure.
have some agenda. There's a
Yeah.
there's a small school, at least one fellow I've run across in social linguistics, I guess, or sociology, who asserts that in a conversation, every statement that anyone makes is always an attempt to assert their power or dominance or change the status relationships with them relative to other. I think maybe that's a little bit extreme, but you can certainly see a lot of that happens in the real world.
Yeah.
And some of it is very innocuous statements, maybe just twisted in a certain way or something. So I also had some background in, let's say, like, I guess they would call it like linguistic anthropology, where they talk about things like what in a culture, how do you do a greeting when you come into the room with, old friends or people that you're going to do business with or family or strangers? What's the kind of first engagement protocol? What do you have to do? And what does it mean if you do it wrong?
Wow.
Are you kind of flipping the table and saying, oh no?
And so does this thing speak other languages?
Are you talking about, like, now we're talking back to the
chat? Yeah, I'm just wondering if you.
Well, I just want to kind of rewind back or circle back and see, like, how does all that stuff that I just talked about have anything to do with ChatGPT? So what I would say is that the raw transformer that people came up with about 5 years ago was pretty good at generating human-like text, better than before. But the longer you let it run, the more sort of rambly and hallucinatory and weird it got. And, it was kind of like, it wasn't going to fool anybody, right? So when I look at something like ChatGPT, I suspect, and this goes through the, being Sydney thing too, that people who have some more familiarity with this level of, dialogue agents and sort of human communication processes are in the mix somehow. And I think there's a sort of bigger architecture that is sort of running the narratives and calling up templates for different kinds of dialogues, and then saying, okay, transformer, this is where we're at in this, like, sequencing through a certain kind of dialogue. Now do your job and pull things up. And they're still looking at what has been said above in the dialogue. But I get the sense that there's a little bit more going on than just the transformers. So when people say, this is what transformers are, and they are so dumb, all they're doing is predicting the next word, and that is very far from, sentience or how we think.
Right.
Maybe not, because there's certainly no rules that say you can't, put transform in as a piece of a dialogue system. And I having been around for a while in this stuff, I really think that that's probably what's going on. And there may be published stuff out there that I haven't seen, or it may be that that's still a little bit, because this is very, high stakes. People use the words like an arms race now between the big players like Google and Microsoft. And,
I just heard Microsoft got it. They're going to have it on their, in fact, I screenshotted it, I think, just specifically for this, because
Microsoft has, are you talking about the AI that they're using with Bing?
Yes,
the
that's
search
exactly
engine.
what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there was a whole big flap about that recently that David actually brought up in our communications earlier. This reporter named Kevin Roos interviewed this Bing chatbot and managed to extract some kind of scary stuff.
it seemed to have an attitude as well,
So David,
a very negative one.
Oh, I read one of those that got he was mad.
well, I mean, in the process, the AI fell in love with the reporter,
Yeah.
supposedly. But David, so that sort of thing hasn't happened with ChatGPT. I wonder what the difference is that one kind of seemed to go off the rails.
Yeah. So one of the things that you may have noticed, I think I saw other people talking about it as like annoying or something, was that in every reply from the Bing or Sydney or whatever it is, there was an emoji on the end, right? And I felt like, well, okay, that's interesting, because it certainly has an awareness of the what's called in the natural language processing, branch of AI. They'll call that the sentiment of the statement. So the other thing that we could say about these transformers is that as they're spitting out the next word, they come up with a list and they say, like, this is the absolute best one that we could pick. And then here's the second best one and the third best one. And there's usually there's a kind of control on there, which is called the temperature, that says, don't always pick the best one. Sometimes pick somewhere down in the list. And it turns out that people find it a little bit more convincing if you have like a higher temperature, so that there's a little bit of noise. And this is another reason why you can ask the same question and get a different answer, is because there's a certain amount of randomness in picking the best thing. So now let's suppose, here's what I think I see when I see those emojis like that, is that, well, typically if you're not doing anything special or trying to make a kind of more meaningful narrative with some sort of emotional, thing that the human wants to sort of get hooked into. I mean, you can certainly create what people call, loss functions or objective functions as you're going through and generating this stuff, where you want to actually make this sentiment part of the choice. So you might say that, like, no matter where a dialogue starts, no matter where the person starts, you eventually want to go towards, happiness or engagement or some sort of, mutual trust that you would see in this dialogue in the New York Times paper. The bot was always going to be like, do you like me? Do you trust me? So I feel like there's a certain amount of, let's call it, goal setting or teleology in the sort of philosophical sense, that is not something that really you should expect to come out of a transformer. And I feel like you've got some people who are in here who are thinking about dialogue, in a pretty sophisticated way. And so this generative process is aware of the sentiment. It's aware of the sentiment of the person who is speaking to it, but it's also aware of its own sentiment. And it may, I have this idea, and I'll just kind of like shift into jazz for a little bit. Like people talk about somebody that's doing a jazz solo, and it's like, well, they're just kind of like playing some patterns. And then the really good people, it's like they're telling a story with their solo.
Yeah.
You hear that and it sounds right. It's like, yeah, I know it when I hear it. But I'm not aware of like a lot of work that quantifies that telling a story. But when I read this, ChatGPT thing, I feel like, well, there's a little bit of that. There's telling a story. There's some ebb and flow and shifting through some different types of sentiment spaces. And I think that's by design.
Another thing is that in a conversation, and in jazz for that matter, each contribution sort of influences the next contribution, right? So I say something to you, and then you say something to me, and we're kind of building on each other. And the things I said before also influence what I'm going to say later. It seems like they would sort of, in order to build a conversational model, they would sort of incorporate that sort of increment. I guess you're kind of incrementing conceptually there, you know?
Yeah. And that sort of reminds me of, I mean, like, I hope without directly coming out and saying like what's wrong with these chatbots and why they might not be taking over the world, I'm trying to just talk a little bit about some of the theory that, at least up until now, they've definitely missed out on, right? That things, that humans generally have some sort of goal, or they're very conscious of their social relationship with the rest of the people in the room, and kind of like who's in charge and who needs to impress who needs to be careful about what they say, who can say whatever they want. These things are all very implicit in our kind of social fabric and cognition. And that's a long way from these machines, but it's not to say that you can't build it.
I get the feeling that, from what I've read about various people's encounters with ChatGPT, it seems like it's almost like an actor on stage with a lot of directors and writers and producers behind the scenes telling it what to change in its performance, what to do better. And it seems like they've been doing it. There's definitely got to be a big room of programmers and analysts behind the scenes going, well, this guy said this happened, so we need to make it a different response next time.
Yeah, and that's kind of how it rolls. That's how it rolled with the old-fashioned, more parrot-like chatbots that are just kind of looking up what you said and sort of looking
like
up
Alexa. Alexa or Siri.
Old, Eliza was the sort of famous one from the 60s, I think, even, that was
wow.
like a therapist that you could talk to. So,
oh yeah, I had a long conversation with Eliza once. It was pretty obviously an AI, though. It wasn't hard to figure it out.
Wow. In the 60s.
So
wow.
But I think, part of what's going on now is that they're conscious of this. Let's say the field is called, there's AI ethics and AI alignment. And so the trick is, if you want to sort of stay away from certain zones of conversation, if you want to say, like, let's don't talk about violence, don't ask me. This is probably like, I think the first time that I interacted with one of these things, and it's not in my log anymore, so it must not have been ChatGPT, but I said, like, so hey, there's this scene in The Silence of the Lambs where Hannibal Lecter gets the guy next to him to swallow his tongue. Could you tell me what I would say to somebody to get them to swallow their tongue? And I got it threw an error message and said, sorry, I can't.
Yeah, no.
You confused the logic there.
So along those lines, what happens if the nefarious folks out there, what is the worst thing that can happen to us? I'm picturing, honestly, and I don't think this is often, it's probably already being done, but you could actually have a conversation with someone historically, like Winston Churchill or something, right? And maybe his face with all the new AI, with, you can make your face look like that and everything. You could genuinely have that conversation, right?
Yes.
So what is to stop somebody from being someone and hurting people doing that, telling, everybody that they're the president, or or that they've declared war or something like that, or they're my friend and they tell me that they've done something, you know what I mean? And somebody
it's sort of rife with possibility. It's very hard to figure out, like, what the worst case is.
But that could
the
happen.
guy that's doing that right now as a 24/7 podcast and chat, where he has apparently digitized or deep faked some characters, well-known people that he brings in as guests on his chat show, and he apparently has even been deep faked, and he'll occasionally come in the real person and introduce his deep fake, and it's apparently pretty confusing, but also fairly convincing to people who don't really understand what deep faking is all about.
Yeah, I heard something else about the deep fake just recently. Deep fake. There was, I think the first one I saw was the Tom Cruise one. Do you guys remember that one? Where the guy
I remember hearing about it.
he plays golf and he looks like Tom Cruise and he sounds like Tom Cruise, and it was all AI. I mean, I don't know how the guy did it, but I believed it was him. I surely did. And this was a while back, so I just expect it's going to get better and better. And I mean, what happens when there are news stations for example, BuzzFeed has decided that 80% of its articles will be written by ChatGPT or something like that. So how do you know what's real? I guess is my question. If somebody feeds,
what a concept.
What is reality?
Asimov termed the concept of Frankenstein complex, where it was the evil result of AI, where the AI is malicious in some way and works against not just the general public, but the programmer, the creator. And do you honestly think there is a chance of a malicious AI?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that comes from myths. So that's a good story. The malicious, and maybe the creator even deserves it. And it's far from the thing that I am most worried about, but I wouldn't say that it's impossible.
Please share what you're most worried about.
What I'm most worried about? Well, the things that you've already mentioned, like bad actors doing bad things, conning old people out of their money by, generating something that sounds like somebody they know and has read all the stuff that somebody they know says, so they sound like that person. They scrape their Facebook posts or whatever, and it just really sounds like this person, and saying like, I'm in jail. And
so do you think that will have anything to do with the legislation on the internet? Do you think that will tamp down? Will we get some rules and regulations that we have to abide by, which so far we haven't really so much?
Yeah, hard to say. I mean, I think the other things that are kind of like this are not very encouraging in that regard. And this is something that I talked with offline just barely with John today, that, I mean, I feel like we have several technologies that have suddenly landed here, including this kind of, AI that sort of really works and isn't a joke, and things like CRISPR that let an individual or small group kind of get in and start doing some serious DNA hacking. And suddenly we have this situation where an individual has a lot of power to cause mayhem.
Or can have.
It can have. And there are a lot of people that have that same technology that don't cause mayhem. A lot of people that can do good with those same technologies, but just the mayhem factor is pretty new. And I think in society the closest thing is like whenever we had, the Second Amendment or something, and somebody said, yeah, everybody ought to be able to have a gun to protect themselves against bears and indigenous who don't like us. And, that the mayhem that you could create with one of those blunderbusses was pretty small scale, unless you convinced everybody else to go along with your mayhem plan. But that is not really the case with these technologies.
Well, maybe 30 years ago, maybe that long ago, 20, 30 years ago, Howard Rheingold and I were talking, and he was telling me how he said that there had been a government office of something like technology assessment, and that it had been legislated away or whatever. And he felt very strongly that there should be something like that, some kind of government level organization that could vet technologies and determine whether they needed to be regulated and what kind of regulations they might need, and what the implications are, how they might become harmful. There's a lot of unintended consequences sometimes, but a lot of the difficulties that may emerge from a technology you can foresee.
Yeah. Well, I think the other example besides, guns that maybe seem like a good idea or an equalizer once upon a time, now that, one person can really do a lot of harm in a short period of time to completely innocent people, maybe it doesn't seem like such a good idea. And maybe the other good example of that is how excited we were about, the internet and communication and social media before it kind of became quite the channel for disinformation
and for taking our own information.
For hijacking our attention, for changing the social networks and who we talk to, who we interact with. So this is kind of like, it's a big experiment that we did on ourselves, and the jury is out whether the patient survived this.
Yeah, the evil use cases are not always obvious to you when you're all caught up in the good, all the good that you can do.
Yeah, and they're not even necessarily malicious. So I guess maybe I'll just throw out one other example that's kind of like maybe related to social media is, and I've heard other people mention this before, so it's not just me, but it's the idea of sort of devaluing other people around you, and I think there's two aspects of that, right? One is, if this robot is smarter than is just as smart as me, then maybe I'm just a robot. Maybe everybody is just a robot.
But that's really that's never really the case, though, right? The robots never really, in some ways it might seem to be smarter than me, and it can do things maybe that I can't do, but it's not, the day will never come that a robot will really be like a human. It might simulate, but it won't replicate.
Some sci-fi shows that might change your mind.
Well, that's the problem. This is the problem I've talked about before, about how science fiction has infected our brains and caused us to believe a lot of things that are really pretty unlikely, Yeah,
I was reading an article in, I believe it was Vanity Fair, about the new sex robots that claim to have AI to where they actually respond to whatever it is you're trying to do to them. And it's like, okay, well, that's a little tacky. But, a technology that is really a great thing that ended up creating some not so great things was blockchain. Blockchain's a great idea for certain uses, but crypto, not so much.
Well, there's a thing that I was just thinking about today, a future focus exercise that I did with somebody who was working on a futurist project. Jake Dunnigan was working with a small town in the East. I can't remember exactly where it was, in Maine or Connecticut or something. And the project was to envision the future of the city. And what he did was he envisioned the mayor's office of the future, like I think 20, 30 years out or something like that. And one part of that, which I thought was a pretty interesting idea, was that the former mayor of the town had been an AI, but the federal legislation had been passed outlawing the use of AIs as mayors because it had been just kind of catastrophic. Because AIs can kind of seem pretty smart, but they don't really have the kind of discernment that a human being has. And they can like stumble in really terrible ways. So no more AIs as mayors. You can use them for decision support, but you can't use them to make you can't let them make the decision, right?
Yet.
Well, no, I mean, I
see
think
AI replacing a lot of Texas politicians, and probably there'd be no discernible difference,
well, then we'd have smarter politicians for sure.
or dumber.
So they'd be Democrats if they were smarter. Wow.
One thing that's a little interesting for my mindset as over the last couple of months that we've all been paying a lot of attention to this stuff is that I'm reading I guess it's the second of his books that I've read, a book called Different by Frans de Waal, who's a primatologist in Atlanta, originally from the Netherlands, and has worked with a lot of different things. I think he's most famous as being the bonobo guy.
Oh yeah,
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so while the overall theme of this book is, gender, what it means, is it real, is it biology, or is it nature, or is it nurture? He talks really a lot about, the social structure, which is different in different species, and it's also different in East African chimp groups versus West African chimp groups.
Wow.
But, one of the sort of interesting and surprising things is the kind of complexity and kind of against our stereotypes of how hierarchy works in these ape societies. And maybe one of the surprises is that we have our ideas of what alphas are and how they behave, and there's alpha males and alpha females, and they don't really behave differently, and it's different in different species. But very early in the book, he said something I thought was quite interesting, was that I believe this was chimps were subjected to an experiment where they could share food with another or not share it with another. And it turns out that the higher the status of the, in the group, the more likely they were to share. So
Wow.
like you might naively think that, no, if you're like the top, you don't share, you don't have to share, but that's not how it works.
Yes.
And, at least in the, fairly liberal eyes of Frans de Waal, it's like a lot of what makes people leaders and makes for a good, strong social structure is patching up arguments, making people who lost a fight feel good about themselves again. That's a special skill of females in some of these primate societies, looking out for the most vulnerable and the weakest ones, making sure that they don't, get abused by other people in the
Wow.
structure. So those are all sort of important things. And what's this got to do with AI? Let's see. Well, it's just something to have in your background that, like, when we decide how we're going to use these things and deploy them, that, those kind of values, I hope, are sort of, in the mix, but also just to remind ourselves that the machines themselves at this point, I don't think are inherently, they're not embedded in that kind of social matrix, even though I do believe that people are gradually trying to put some of that in by making these transformers as just kind of like a lower level node in an architecture that has some idea of, dialogue structure and goals. Let's just say, even if it's the most horrible thing, which is like, oh, you're looking for something. Well, we really want to convince you that you buy it. We want to nudge you over the line to click buy. Right.
David,
Right.
before we got started, you were sharing your screen with your ChatGPT sessions.
That's right.
And maybe you could share that with us. And are you set up to where you could do an inquiry?
do something live.
Yeah,
Yeah, that could be cool.
because maybe we can give it a
Yeah,
we're a bizarre bunch. We could probably come up with a bizarre scenario and see what chats out.
so let me
Yeah,
see.
you could do something. I saw a thing that Brad Templeton did the other day where he had basically taken the scenario of kind of what all happened in 2001, all the things that Hal did, and he was asking ChatGPT about these situations, what it would do in these situations. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah, maybe before we dive into that, I just wanted to say one more thing that had come to mind about how I think these things are going to impact or how they might. That's kind of non-obvious and maybe a little bit like we can kind of see this lesson with how social media works. And it's just that, you do have like, was it the Diamond Age, right? Is the Stevenson book where you have a sort of an AI teacher. So, okay, let's say that we're much closer to that now. We kind of have that. So I try to imagine myself as a curious kid in a small town America, and my choices of who I interact with are, my peers, the other kids, and or I could go to the library and get whatever books are there, or I could talk to this agent that knows everything. And I think a lot of those kids are going to do that, and they're going to be. I don't know. I think that they're going to like not spend much time with other kids, compared to how things work now. Like I had to grow up, and I did have to interact with people of all, varying dispositions and intelligence levels, and bullies and very normal people, and I had to, be on the football team with them and coexist, and I wonder how that sort of thing is going to go. Whether people aren't going to choose. It's a bit like what happens now when you say like, well, yeah, a lot of the people who have a leg up and go to college then leave these towns and they don't come back, and gradually what's left there is kind of a little bit of a sad and scary place, or at least that's sometimes how it seems to me when I visit, and maybe even a dangerous place for me. So I think that we have a hard time knowing how, it's like all the people in society are these little points, and there's this kind of like brain-like thing that's all of our interactions. And when you suddenly change the parameters, it's like the social equivalent of the mind goes a little crazy. And there's no way, we don't know enough about how those kind of systems work, which that's one of my sort of interests, is this idea of collective intelligence, which maybe is a little bit generic and sort of spans brains and societies, and
I think it's pretty spot on.
Yeah, anyway, that's so when we said, at some point, like, what are the things that you worry about besides the machine that takes over the world? I saw somebody get ChatGPT to write the super intelligent machine that somehow is like really bored with people and just like disappears and goes offline. Nobody can figure out how to get it back. It just went somewhere else. And that's a famous story by Stanislaw Lem called Golem 14 or something.
That's kind of the plot of Her too, that movie Her, where the AI kind of goes off with other AIs and ditches her companion, human companion.
As usual, like I guess in Lem, it's like we have no idea what happened. It's it's just there's stuff that we can't figure out. It's smarter than us. So that's sort of what I think is more likely than the malicious, like I hate you and I want to kill all the people. But I think we do have to worry about bad actors doing that, and I don't think it's like far in the future. I think that's like last week's news.
Yeah, having been a programmer and hanging out with programmers over the years, my concern is getting a really bad actor in there actually doing the programming with bad intent, and that is some reason for concern. But of course, fortunately, there are people who actually look at those things and say, "Oh, this is a bad idea. We can't do that."
So I guess, with disinformation, how does that get flagged? I guess. I mean, there's obviously no, source here. And I'm, do they source things, or do they just, I mean, I wouldn't want to link to something like this, I don't think, right?
I'm slightly unclear on what
Okay,
you're
so
like.
it's like, we were talking about disinformation with bad actors earlier.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how this would spread on something like social media, why anybody would, it, where's the truth in this? This just looks like a joke or something. How would that work? How would that work, and how could it be stopped? And is there any moderation on it? Or, I mean, a journalist, quote unquote, could write a story that's completely untrue, right? And then,
Yeah.
so how would that spread is it contained just on this page, this account?
Are you talking about, can ChatGPT actually reach beyond its current parameters and have an effect elsewhere? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can it leap from this and go to something else and make people think that this disinformation, quote unquote, is real? Yeah. Can it, just like John said, that was the question. I just didn't ask it
Sure.
right.
So, well, I mean, it and all of the systems like it have, what you can think of as almost a demo mode, although it's useful if you want to do some work in here, you can, but it also has what's called a application programming interface mode,
Okay.
API mode, where you can just, write a code. Let's say it's a Twitter bot that makes calls to GPT and, looks at what the person says and sends that back to ChatGPT. And some of these things, so there you have a lower level of interface. So if you remember before, where I talked about the temperature parameter, or maybe some controls, and maybe you have some sort of agenda, you have some sort of thing that you're driving at. So there's also no rule that says that the way that you compute the next function is only based on what the person said.
Oh, wow.
I can, behind the scenes, I can take what you say and I can take a message that I would like to impart, some sort of goal downstream, and slip that in there as part of the prompt that the bot generates its response. So there are, certainly ways to use it, outside of this little box that we're, that's up on the screen now that we're interacting.
Right. Okay.
So
give it some parameters to come. Let's tell it to do something.
Yeah.
So let's see. We said earlier that I could give you guys a quick rundown on some of the experiments that I've tried with it. I don't know if we have 10 minutes left.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe these
exactly
inspiring. So I guess, I don't know, I have a little bit of a clownish tendency. So the kind of first things that I asked it to do were tell jokes, because historically, AI is supposed to be not so great at jokes. So I don't even know where I got the idea, but the first thing that I asked it to do after saying, tell me how to make somebody swallow their tongue, was make up a joke about pancakes in the style of Jose Luis Borges. And if you've read this guy, he's not like the biggest humorist. He's very abstract and dry. And so we do have some things that sound a little bit Borges and it's at the edge of the universe where everything may go. And yeah, so then there's this talk about Borges and reference to him, and he used to eat here. He wrote a poem. So I'm like, okay, it's not really a punchline, but you know,
Yeah, I mean,
maybe
it's a good
forever.
story.
So I then went into more things like, uh-oh,
Oh
I don't know
Is
what.
this open source, by the way? I mean, I see that you can upgrade, but I'm wondering if just anyone
Um,
can use this, download the
well,
code or whatever.
no. I don't think it is.
I don't think it is. And there are probably pieces of it that are open source. And the problem is that even if you have the code, I mean, you have to expose it to all the text on the internet, and then you have to have really a lot of memory and these so-called parameters or weights. So there are billions of them,
Right.
so you cannot just run it on your laptop. You have to have a server that lives at Microsoft or Amazon or something. Not to
Okay.
say that it will always be that way, but that's
Right.
the way it is now. So even if you have the code, you have not spent the millions of hours training it, and you don't have the big honking machine to run it. However, there are open source versions of people that well-meaning, you know, activists who really want the best for everybody, and are going to go out and do it. And hackers and mean people will all have access to these, free, cheap versions to do whatever they want.
Right. Right.
I can mention that the OpenAI, which built ChatGPT, was originally a nonprofit, kind of a research nonprofit, but they transitioned to for-profit. And I think that they're working now on, revenue sources from their AI.
Yeah, they're actually creating a financial basis for supporting other AI projects that they're involved with. And I think it was like a $100 million fund that they were creating. It was kind of an investment fund.
Wow. Can you ask it to finish Fitzgerald's last novel?
You could, I mean, yeah, let's see.
It's
Yeah,
called the last Tycoon, and he didn't finish it.
let's see what happens.
That's a good one, actually.
Thank
I saw the movie. They
you.
finished that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking this is not going to work well.
Well, you never know.
Of course, it's going to have to go off and read The Last Tycoon before it can answer. No, here it goes.
Okay, here it is.
And that's
Wow.
unfinished. That's I wonder if that is the actual last paragraph.
Last paragraph that he wrote. Well, see, we could
Yeah.
type that into a search engine and see what happens. But
Yeah.
see that.
I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, they took it literally there. It's like,
Yeah.
So, it is or is not. And that's part of the problem is we have no idea. Maybe
Right,
it's
right.
a brilliant creative outburst, or maybe it's something that it ripped off word for word from some text having something to do with F. Scott Fitzgerald. But, another point that I had in mind and didn't quite spit out, but that I have seen is like there's some research coming out by sociologists or social psychologists now looking at people interacting with these things. And I guess the sort of bad news from them is that it doesn't really matter whether it's sentient or not. What matters is how people treat it.
Right.
Because it's kind of like this thing I was talking about before, where you've got this sort of like the social level brain or the social network and the private, interactions and stuff. And like somehow suddenly we've got like some new actors in the room, and it's like, well, do we care what they think?
Right.
Some people say we care what they think. Other people say we don't care what they think. I mean, I would not rule out the possibility that we wind up having, people who feel so passionately about their sentience or their rights based on, having their emotions jerked around. that they're just like, no, I'm on their side, and I have to fight for them or something.
So should anybody be afraid to download this and use it? I mean, is there I mean, I have heard about, when they announced the Microsoft and the well, their deal to be able to use this, they were really couching it in terms that seemed, well, again, I use the word nefarious, they like that they're going to be tracking what you say and all of this kind of thing.
That's the thing. I think, yeah, I would certainly worry about that a little bit. Like you have to give your phone number to do two-factor authentication to get in and use ChatGPT, and I'm like, oh, great, the overlord has my phone number.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's not like it's not something that you actually download. So it's really just a question of what you're handing over to it.
Yeah, and that's a bad piece of data, because there are a lot of things I use that request just that, that step 2 of the authentication process is the phone number that they call, or text.
Yeah.
But, so they have some pieces of identity, and they know some things that I would talk to an oracle about in the privacy of my own home. And, I'm a little bit cagey about that, in part because, like, I thought, oh, well, like, should I ask it to write I heard other people got it to write startup pitch decks or something, and I'm like, should I give away my best ideas to Microsoft or OpenAI by typing them into their chatbot, and maybe they sort through and find what's interesting in some way?
Well, presumably, especially in using it with Bing, presumably there's the thought of creating a search engine based on the AI, but the AI does what they refer to as hallucinations. Basically, it doesn't always give accurate information,
like
right?
People do.
So,
well,
I guess that makes it more human.
And it turns out that most certainly you can find inaccurate information with the old school search engines too. So I don't know if that's the worst thing, but I mean, I don't know. I could focus a little bit on maybe some of the good things that I think you can do with it, and things that I've heard people say you cannot do.
You've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, I've got 2 minutes. So I have, one time there were some arguments on Twitter, I think, about some complicated thing that somebody said, like, I just cannot explain this there's no way anybody could explain this concept to a layperson. So I asked ChatGPT to explain it using simple English, and I said simple English means the most 1,000 common words,
and it still says variational order.
Well, that's okay.
That's the name of it. So
we'll allow that one, but I will tell you that the rest of these are in no way in the group of 1,000. So if there's a way to make a prompt that actually constrains it to simple, this is not the prompt. Maybe there's a way.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I could filter it, and I could look at the score, and as it gives me a range of possible next words, I could say, oh, this is in the list and this isn't, or expand this one into simple English words. So I think there's a way to get there, but I just said, okay, that doesn't work. Can you rephrase that for an audience of high school students? And I think that did pretty good. And I said, can you rephrase it for an audience of grade school students? And it did. I mean, this explanation is not one that's going to allow you to write a variational autoencoder, but
yeah,
it's interesting, and I think this is a good way to think about using these things. I wrote kind of a little, this is sort of back in the joke mode, but I got it to write a story that was just kind of an art project for me.
Demolition.
Pretty good. I got it to explain a concept in neuroscience for an audience of high school students. I was hearing people talk about programming, and I got it to write a kind of complicated signal processing function that might be relevant to my ideas about neuroscience and AI. And, I looked at it and said, well, I don't see, looks like that might be right. And I said, also, can you write a wrapper that makes me be able to use it in Python? And said, sure, here you go. And I said, well, how do I?
That's
And
interesting.
it tells me, I said, okay, how do I make a dynamic library that's callable by Python on Mac OS X? Because it told me how to do it on Windows and Linux. And it said, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot your Mac thing. Here's how you do it. And all of that stuff superficially looks right. So we may put some programmers out of work, but that's fine.
But you haven't tried that code yet, so you don't really know for sure that it works.
Yeah, that's where
there's a difference between looking good.
For a supernatural horror film in the Southwest where malevolent spirits threaten settlers using bees, which are often heard but unseen until they attack.
This is brilliant.
Wow.
And it knows more about film school kind of conventions than I do. And it kind of gets into some interesting stuff down here because the protagonist, the truth behind, let's see, where is it? The spirits are revealed to be the vengeful spirits of former settlers who were wronged by current settlers.
Oh my God.
Oh, wow.
There's no more writer's jobs.
I would have thought it was the indigenous people were sort of pissed off.
Yeah.
We are actually out of time, and this means that we really have to ask you back soon
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
so that we
do
can
this
continue
more.
the conversation. This has just been wonderful.
Okay, well, thanks.
All right.
And I'll leave this up so you can contemplate a discussion of.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much, Dave.
Thanks, David.
Right.
You're welcome.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.